Let's get started. This seminar is going to be a bit of a beginner introduction to rating, but I hope everyone at least gets reminded of something important. I'm going to try and go through this fairly quickly. I've got a few points to cover, and hopefully I don't go too long. But yeah, let's get going. So we've all got varying levels of experience here and there with Lotro and other MMOs in general. But I want you to, for a moment, put yourselves in the shoes of someone who's brand new to this game. They open up the game, they choose a class they think looks cool, and they start to play. And what they get is a very fun, deep, beautiful, and social experience for years of jam-packed content. But then, once they reach max level, it's only natural that they seek to improve their character with more shiny gear, and they see this gear on some people with like 5 times as much health as them who are running around. Unfortunately, this is where many people run into a hard wall. For some people, this landscape experience has been years long with the same character, and regrettably, Lotro landscape does hardly anything at all to prepare you for playing in a group doing anything approaching difficult content. So that's what we're here to do. We're going to demystify the raiding experience and explain some of the hidden things that make raiding so hard to get into as someone new to the endgame scene. What we will talk about today will apply to all instances of any size larger than solo, but most of my examples will use the full 12-man raid size, since that's where most of the complexity comes in. So, what is a raid? Well, put very simply, a raid or instance is any piece of group content in the game that requires intentional coordination between the players. That's how I'm defining it. Intentional coordination. And in Lotro, these come in 3, 6, and 12 player sizes, and usually scale up in difficulty based on their size as well. I feel as though I should have turned off cosmetic emotes happening to me, but this is going to be amusing if people manage to find me and do festival things to me. So yeah, we've got different sizes, 3, 6, and 12, and we've also got different tiers, and I'll just briefly explain the tiers now. We've got 5 tiers of difficulty in most of our instances, and as they go up 1, 2, 3, some hidden debuffs get applied to the player by the enemies. So the enemies get more health, they get more damage as we go up in tier. But through tiers 1, 2, and 3, the enemies get more resistance, which means that you need more finesse to avoid being resisted. The enemies also get more mitigations, they get more crit defense, and we'll get into that a bit later. They also reduce your mitigations and your resistance. So you need more mitigations as a tank and more resistances in general to offset the effects that are going to come into you. Those numbers I won't go into exactly, but you can find tables around the place that show you the values you need to aim for. But it's quite annoying that it's not shown on your character sheet at all. The value, the percentage that you see on your character sheet is just your tier 1 landscape value. At tier 2 and tier 3, you need high values to achieve maximum effectiveness. So back to raids. Raids in general can be separated into 2 sections. We've got trash pools and we've got boss fights. Trash pools sometimes require significant cooperation, but usually they just serve as some building blocks towards a boss fight. In lots of good raids, trash will seek to teach you some basic mechanics about the boss fights to come, but that's not always the case. However, we can see this in Hidden Horde with the very first sets of trash before boss 1. Even without accounting for the fact that these very same mobs appear in boss 3, the mechanics of the warriors, hunters, and seers introduce mechanics that you face in the boss fight. And that being said though, trash is not really why we come to raid. We come to raid to get loot, and loot comes from the boss fights. So boss fights are where rubber hits the road for raiding. This is where all that coordination and skill are required to achieve those high tier boss kills. And it's where the best rewards in the game tend to come from. So, how do you kill a boss in Lotro? Well, before we get to killing the boss, let's briefly chat about who you'll be killing the boss with. You've got to bring 12 people to a raid fight. But what are those people going to be doing? Well, in Lotro, characters tend to fit into one of 3 roles, depending on the spec that they're playing. You've got DPS, you've got tanks, and you have healers. I'm going to come back to so-called support specs in a second. So first up, we have DPS. These are your bread and butter damage dealers. Every class in the game has a DPS line they can play, but unfortunately, not all DPS are created equal at this stage. As a DPS, your main job is simply to do damage, make sure you're hitting the right target, and blast away. Now, next we have tanks. Tanks have quite a few classes that can fill that role, though at the moment there are 3 main meta tanks that can be used commonly at the higher levels. We've got Guardians, Captains, and Brawlers. Now, the job of the tank is twofold, and this is important. Now, firstly, obviously, you need to make sure that you are the one that takes the hits, since your character, more than any other, has the ability to withstand the sorts of damage that gets dished out in these fights. This is achieved through the threat system, which I'll explain in more detail in the upcoming tanking seminar. But the key takeaway for everyone is that unless enemies are very spread out, you do not need to wait to deal damage to them. Tanks have plenty of tools to keep aggro of a target, so there is rarely a time where you need to wait before dealing damage. Now, secondly, since the enemies are following tanks around, tanks get to decide where the fight happens. This is a really important point. More than any other role, tanks have to be familiar with the strategy laid out by the raid leader so that the plans happen in the right place, not just at the right time. Tanks get to decide where the fight happens, not just how the fight happens. So, lastly, we have healers. Their job is quite simple, though by no means is it easy. Healers are tasked with keeping the rest of the raid alive by, well, restoring health. This is done mostly to the tanks, as they will be taking the vast majority of the punishment, but raid healing is also required, even with perfect play. More often than not, raid members will suffer unavoidable damage that has to be covered somehow. Okay, so I promised I'd return to the so-called support characters. Apologies to Lawmasters and Burglars, Captains alike. Every class brings some amount of support to the raid, even if it's just slightly. For example, if we look on my Guardian here, I'll turn my UI back on, you can see the Break Ranks trait gives the raid a buff of 40% damage. That's great. Roomkeepers can bring stun rocks, they can bring armor reduction, the list goes on. However, these classes are doing the support while they're performing their main role. So why would we bring someone who just supports as their entire role? Well, there are 3 specs in the game that allocate almost all of their abilities to supporting the rest of the raid, as opposed to dealing damage, healing, or tanking themselves. Red Captains, Yellow Burglars, and Yellow Lawmasters. The support that these characters bring is so powerful that it easily values them at more than just one raid slot of any other role. They provide extra damage for the raid, they reduce the damage from enemies, they lock enemies down, sometimes indefinitely, and much more. So knowing how to utilize your Captain, Burglar, and Lawmaster is key to success in raiding in Lotro. Okay, so back to the main point. How do we kill a boss? Well, it's easy. You bring its health to 0. The boss dies and you get loot. Awesome. Seminar done. That's as easy as it is, right? We just bring 12 DPS players to kill the boss as fast as possible. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And I've got a little group comp window here. I hope you can all see that. This is my example group comp. We're going to bring all DPS to the boss fight. We're going to deal heaps of damage, and it's easy. Oh no. That's all right. We've covered the inappropriate parts with the group comp. This is good. Okay, so unfortunately, it's not as simple as just bringing 12 DPS. That'd be great, but bosses are more interesting than training dummies most of the time. They throw obstacles at us to solve. So at the basic level, the boss does a bunch of damage. So we have to bring a tank. So let's put a tank in. There we go. Now, it turns out the tank is now taking a bunch of damage, so we need to bring a healer to take care of that. So let's bring a healer. And it turns out they're taking heaps of damage. So let's bring 2 healers, or maybe 3, or maybe 4, or maybe 5. I don't know how many healers we actually need. But wait a minute, we've got our support classes. So instead of heaps of healers, let's bring a Lawmaster who can reduce the damage of the enemies, and a Burglar who can also reduce the damage of the enemies by a significant amount. So they're going to keep their laws and disables up at all times, looking at you Lawmasters and Burglars, and the tank is not going to take nearly as much damage. Okay, so we're going to settle on 2 healers, we're going to settle on our Lawmaster and Burglar, and we've got a tank. That leaves a spot for 7 DPS, which is great. Now some fights actually will happen like this. There are some boss fights where you can deal with the entire boss with just 1 tank, 2 healers, your Lawmaster and Burglar, and 7 DPS. But most bosses are more complicated than that. So we've dealt with the basic enemy of the boss. He does auto attacks on the tank. Tank takes damage. Healers heal it up. Lawmaster's debuff, but not so fast. There's some other things we have to take care of. We have to deal with mechanics. Now, mechanics is just a catch-all term that we use to describe literally anything that happens in the raid, aside from the boss doing a basic attack on the tank. And the way that we deal with mechanics varies greatly from fight to fight. How we deal with a particular fight is referred to as the strategy. So some mechanics are targeted at specific players or roles, and others affect the entire raid. Let's look at boss 3 of Hidden Horde as an example. So I hope everyone's fairly familiar with Hrimmel in the Hidden Horde raid. The first mechanic that comes from Hrimmel is that she places a debuff on the tank every 15 seconds. This debuff reduces the tank's frost mitigation, and the boss does frost damage. Every time Hrimmel casts the debuff, it tears up, getting stronger with each application. Beyond a certain point, the tank has run out of cooldowns and is just going to die. This is not good, obviously. So what's the strategy? Well, we can just bring another tank. That way, the new tank can take aggro, the first tank will have the debuff fall off, and happy days. Both tanks can live. Now that was a very targeted mechanic, but I hope you can already see that the strategy, and as a result, the desired raid composition, is determined by the mechanics, which will change from fight to fight. Let's look at one more mechanic from Hrimmel. Every 45 seconds or so, Hrimmel will target a random player and center a breath attack on that location, killing pretty much anyone within about a 25-degree cone from her location outwards. This mechanic is not solved by adding or removing a role, but instead, we just move out of the way. So you can see there are plenty of ways to deal with mechanics, and no one is exempt from them. Now just a quick note here about the value of really good DPS in your raid composition. Mechanics are really hard, and they often occur on a timer. The bigger your DPS is, therefore, the fewer mechanics your raid has to deal with. Now this might be why you see some people breeze through fights that you struggle with to no end, or when you invite a very experienced player to your group, it becomes noticeably easier, especially if they're playing DPS. It's not just that they're less likely to make mistakes themselves, it's also probably that they are removing opportunities for you to make mistakes as well. Good DPS always makes fights easier. Okay, so I'm going to fill in this raid comp now for one that might look good for Hrimmel Tier 4. I know lots of you won't have experience in that fight, but it has a pretty consistent raid comp that we bring. And this is what it looks like. We got two tanks in the tank group, 2 healers, a Lawmaster and a Burglar, and we have a tank and a healer in the DPS group along with 4 DPS. This is a pretty standard Tier 4 Hrimmel composition. So we've got our roles and some of our classes. We've got Lawmaster and Burglar, but how do we decide which specific classes to bring in for each of these roles? Well, for starters, most buffs that apply to the raid do not stack with themselves. For example, a captain's motivating speech applies only once, no matter how many captains cast it. That means we definitely want a captain, so let's put a captain in here, but bringing a second captain is less valuable. Now, there are exceptions to this. Captains have tools that having 2 of them might be very useful, but as a general rule, 1 captain, very good. Second captain, still good, but not quite as good as the first one. Now, for that reason, so long as the class can fulfill the strategy required, we like to bring as much variety as possible. So let's also put in a Guardian over here, and we'll bring a Brawler as well. These all bring different buffs that don't stack with themselves, so let's bring them all. Get all the buffs. Now this is the same with the healers. All the healers bring different strengths, and as long as they're able to fulfill the strategy required, they all bring different buffs, so we might as well bring each one. So let's bring a Runekeeper healer. We'll bring a Bjorning, and we'll also bring a Minstrel. All these bring different buffs and debuffs, and they all have different strengths. So let's bring all 3 different healers. Okay, so what about DPS? We have so many DPS specs to choose from, and so few spots. How do we decide on which to bring? Now, in general, we want our DPS choice, as always, to be governed by the mechanics that need to be combated in the raid. Which classes are going to be most effective at dealing with them? Now, there are many things that break this down for us, so I won't go into much detail right now, but we can look at our current fight to see what would work best. So in Boss 3, Hrimmel, we have many waves of adds to deal with, all of which only have very little health. Now this heavily favors burst DPS over dot-based DPS. So classes like burglars, champions, hunters are going to be favored over classes like runekeepers and wardens, which take a bit of time to ramp up. Now, there are also lots of mobs, which favors AoE damage, but on the other hand, they're often very far apart, which heavily favors range damage. Now, all of this put together has us, unfortunately, favoring hunters. So we're just going to bring in 4 hunters so far to the raid, and this is a pretty good looking raid comp. Now that we've decided on hunters, we need to support them as best that we can so that we can do as much damage in the raid as possible. And this is where a lot of people's knowledge stops. So if you faded out of attention, come back. This is going to be hopefully very valuable. So you might have noticed that on a training dummy, some DPS players can perform 400, 500, even more DPS on the training dummy. And yet in a boss fight, you can see numbers of over 1 million DPS, depending on the boss fight. Now that is all down to support. There are many ways to support the DPS players, and it's helpful to understand how these buffs and debuffs interact so that you can get the most out of your damage. Now, firstly, we have a very simple one, general bonus damage. I'm going to take this away, and I'm going to bring up my UI again so I can show you break ranks. Break ranks just does group damage. It's just plus damage, very easy. All the damage that the raid does is going to go up. Awesome. But now, you might have seen some buffs that benefit range damage versus melee damage, or even tactical damage. How do you know which skills are going to get affected by those buffs and debuffs? Well, we can look at ranged, tactical, and melee here. You can see that, for example, Guardian's Ward is a melee skill. It says on my tooltip, melee skill. You can look at Let Fly. This is a range skill. And you can even look at, this is the one I found, Shield Taunt. That's a tactical skill. Now, if you see on your tooltip, this is a tactical skill, any debuff that says this enemy is going to take increased tactical damage, those are the skills that are going to get affected by it. So that's what you have to look out for on your tooltip. Does it say tactical skill, melee skill, or range skill? Okay, but what about oils? This is going to be interesting. So let's look at another thing. Let's look at enemy stats. Enemies have stats just like player characters. Enemies have mitigations, they have crit defense, and they have resistance. We can look at my stats. They're very similar. I have resistance, I've got crit defense, and I've got mitigations. Enemies have just the same, and they're all going to impact your damage. Finesse is what we use to bypass resistance. So you can see finesse, it just says it reduces your opponent's resistance and reduces their block, parry, and evade. So that's how we deal with resistance. There are some debuffs that reduce enemies' resistance as well, but finesse is our main tool to do that with. Crit defense is also dealt with by debuffs and mitigations as well, but mitigations is the big one. By default, enemies have 40% mitigation to all damage sources. That's a huge amount. That means if you deal 100 damage, only 60 of that is getting into the boss as real health loss. That's huge. So what can we do to deal with mitigations? Well, plenty of classes have ways to deal with the enemy's mitigations. Lawmasters, for example, can reduce the boss's fire mitigation by 20% with their Raven Pet debuff. But hold on, fire mitigation, we've got a new type of debuff, fire damage. How does that work? Well, to see what sort of mitigation your damage will get processed by, you need to look at the damage value on your skill tooltip. So for example, War Chant here, it says it does 18,000 to 26,000 light damage. That means it's going to get mitigated by light mitigation. Physical and tactical mitigation debuffs also exist just to make things more interesting, and they are a catch-all for all these types. Fire, light, frost, etc. all pass through tactical mitigation, and common, Balerian, ancient dwarf, all those damage types pass through physical mitigation. Okay, so my final point about buffs and debuffs is to notice the power of debuffs on the enemy compared to buffs on the player. Not all buffs and debuffs have 100% uptime. There are going to be times when you can't use them. So take Oathbreakers and Burn Hot, for example. They only last a short time, but have really long cooldowns. If I used Burn Hot, I get my damage buff, and I do more damage. Awesome. But then if the captain uses Oathbreakers at some other time, the boss is going to take more damage, and I'm doing more damage. Great. But however, if you use both of them at the same time, the resulting damage that you do to the boss is going to equal greater than the sum of the two buffs together. Now, this is because Oathbreakers adds incoming damage to the boss, so you're effectively multiplying Burn Hot's effectiveness. This is true of any buff or debuff combo, and this is the main reason why coordinated groups do so much more DPS than uncoordinated ones. It's less to do with individual player power, although that's definitely a component. It's much more to do with the fact that all these debuffs and buffs are going out at the right time, they're going out together, and they're multiplying their power with each other. So that was just one example. We've got our raid comp here, and because of this buff and debuff combo, we're going to add in a warden into this mix, because wardens have some great debuffs which reduce the enemy's physical and tactical mitigation. They also have a great buff for induction speed that will affect the hunters very positively. And so we're supporting our hunter DPS really well with this warden. But also, wardens are going to do heaps of damage on their own, and so it's not like we're losing out on heaps by bringing one. There's plenty of damage that a warden can do in this fight as well. So this was just one example, but I hope it helps you make sense of how raid comps work. There are less meta classes that are not taken because buffs might get overlapped, or maybe you have to take some weird support to make it work really well. But you can use these principles to see how raid comps are built for any instance. My last thing to say is that all of this should not be taken with 100% priority. This sort of optimization for a raid comp and how buffs and debuffs interact is necessary for really high tiers, and it's going to make your lower tier runs easier, but it's really not necessary. Just use what you have. If you've got a really good champion player, bring your champion. If you've got a really good burglar DPS, bring your burglar. There's nothing wrong with it. Just take into consideration what changes you might have to make with your strategy to accommodate for your other DPS. And yes, Atal, I see you typing. Bring red rune keepers as well. And also take into account what sort of support you need to bring to make your DPS shine. Any change in your DPS comp is going to mean that you want to focus on different things with your support. Your Lawmaster might need to bring out different pets. You might need to make sure that you have, Minstrel applying light mit debuffs in Melody stance to get some extra light mitigation reduced. So all these things can contribute to how your damage is going to work. So take all these tips, use them as best you can, but most of all, have fun raiding, and hopefully this will help you clear some harder bosses in the future. So that's all I've got for you up front. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have now, and we'll keep the recording going as long as questions keep coming in, or until we get to around 10 p.m. server time, I think will be when we'll cut off. Okay, yes. Lola has a question. Which damage types go through tactical and which go through physical? Fire Law and Frost Law. Okay, so Fire Law and Frost Law reduce the enemy's physical and tactical damage. So those are going to go through your physical and tactical mitigations on the tank. But if you're talking about, say, there's a Lawmaster debuff that increases the amount of tactical damage that the boss takes, then you have to look at the skill and see if it's a tactical skill or not. So for example, on Guardians, I have Shield Taunt, which is a tactical skill. And I'm sure if you have a Runekeeper or a Lawmaster or whatever, you're going to see plenty of tactical skills. But it's key to realize that tactical damage does not increase, for example, Swiftbow with Fire Oil, because even though it does fire damage, it's a ranged skill. Yeah, so that's the distinction that's really important. It's a ranged skill that is dealing fire damage, so it will be increased by debuffs that increase range damage, but it will also be increased by debuffs that reduce fire mitigation. That's not confusing at all. But it is how this game that we love works, so enjoy that fact. Yes, someone has requested to speak. Hello, Hilary.
Hello. I have a question about classes like Bjorning that have both melee and tactical skills. Their main source of mastery, like Bjorning, would be physical mastery, but how important is tactical mastery to that? I
Mm.
know there are other classes that have the same issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. With Bjornings, you should receive tactical mitigation also from might. I think you get points from both, which is great. You get some tactical mastery, but I think the majority of your damage is going to come from physical damage, and so you probably want to prioritize physical mastery. What you can do
Yes.
is look at a combat analysis breakdown, and I'll talk about this tomorrow in the plugin seminar. If you look at a combat analysis breakdown, you can scroll down and you can see what damage types you did and how much of your damage came from which types. And that will be a really good indicator of how much you want to prioritize different mastery values. So obviously, you're doing damage with bees and other things that do tactical. I think one of your roars is a tactical skill. Um, but then how much of your total damage is that? And decide on how much you want to invest into tactical mastery based on that. You are going to get a benefit, but it might not be a huge benefit, so it might not be worth it.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
no worries.
When we're in a raid, so Oathies, when somebody says Oathies in 20 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
as a hunter, red hunter, which I am, I should basically save my potions and all my burn hots and everything for when that happens. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yeah. So the key with lining up your debuffs and buffs is obviously raid communication. Burn Hot and Oathbreakers have a very nice cooldown cycle. Oathbreakers has a 3-minute cooldown, Burn Hot has a 1-minute 30, so you can use Burn Hot twice for every one Oathbreakers, and it should line up every time. But yeah, you do want to line it up. And so that means if you do get out of sync with Oathbreakers, it's actually better to wait for the next Oathbreakers to hit your Burn Hot with the Oathbreakers, because you'll get heaps of extra damage. And you can do similar things with your skill priority. You can save, for example, Heartseeker. If it's like 10 seconds to Oathbreakers and your Heartseeker's on cooldown, you can wait until the Oathbreakers comes out to hit your next Heartseeker. You can do the same sort of thing with Upshot and Merciful Shot, all these sorts of big hitting skills that might have longer cooldowns. So you can get as many uses of them inside that window as possible. Um, that'll
Okay.
all help you eke out more DPS. And the same thing with
Sounds
big
like a
AoE
lot of work.
situations. Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about, but these are all things that you can help to improve yourself on DPS. So I think another one is if there's a big AoE situation that's coming up, and you're going to have some like brawler buffs coming out that are going to help you. You might want to line that up with Burn Hot and hit all your AoE skills at the same time. So yeah, lots of
All right.
things to think
Thank
about.
you.
But yeah, thanks for your question. Hello.
Hi there. Thank you for this class. It's awesome. I know the answer to this because I've been in enough raids, but maybe for those who might not, how do you choose between the tank group and the DPS group? Well, actually, that's the answer: tank versus DPS.
Yeah.
The healers go with the tanks, et cetera, et cetera.
No, this is a great question, and it's not always as simple as it might seem. So I just filled in these without any explanation, but there was rhyme to the reason, to the madness, however that saying goes. Anyway, so you are correct. The healers want to be with the tanks. That's kind of because their AoE heals often only affect the Fellowship, but that's really the key. You want to look at what things affect the Fellowship versus what affects the entire raid. So you might have, for example, Inspire Fellows, question mark, not being a minstrel main myself, that only affects the Fellowship, I'm going to say with all confidence. And so that's why we have the minstrel in the DPS group here, because the minstrel is going to be mostly responsible for healing the DPS. And so we want Inspire Fellows and the big one where they raise their instrument into the sky, which is going to come. Triumph of Spirit, that's the one that it is. That also affects the Fellowship, and so things that affect the Fellowship, you want obviously to be in the same group as them. Now this can involve some crazy stuff where mid-fight you might swap the minstrel into the tank group, so the minstrel gives the minus incoming damage buff to the tanks when they really need it. You can do that mid-fight, but in general, the answer is you want to base things off what buffs and what healing and all these sorts of things are going to get affected by the Fellowship versus by the entire raid. So a key example here is Bjornings. A lot of Bjorning heals affect the entire raid regardless of which group they're in. So we can throw them in the tank group, and they're still going to be able to heal the DPS just as effectively. So those are the things to think about. Obviously, I won't go through every example of why I've put all these classes in the groups that they're in, but the general answer is some buffs affect the raid and some buffs affect the Fellowship. Some heals affect the raid, some heals affect the Fellowship, and so we organize the groups as best we can according to those restrictions. But yeah, thanks for that question. That's a really good one. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. At the beginning, you said something about DPS not ever having to wait to begin doing damage.
Mm-hmm.
Were you just speaking to like boss fights? Because like in the Doom skirmish, if the tank is pulling their group down the hill and the DPS doesn't wait till you pack them all together, the two groups, that DPS and the healers die.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll go into a bit more detail because you've asked that question. It's actually often bad to wait, like actively bad to wait. And that's because of how threat gets generated by tanks in the modern day. Back in the past, Guardians and other people would do damage to deal threat. So we'd do our shield skills and we get bonus threat from doing them, and we'd be able to keep up with DPS by doing damage. And our taunts would just be taunts. They would last for 5 seconds and the guy would attack us for 5 seconds. But if we didn't generate enough threat, then the guy would just run away after the taunt was done. Nowadays, taunts act as threat multipliers. This is a bit of a confusing concept, but basically the way it works is I taunt someone, they are forced to attack me for 10 seconds because I'm a Guardian and Guardians are great. 10-second taunt. Then a whole bunch of people do damage to them and I do nothing. So let's say I just do nothing to the enemy. I've not generated a single piece of threat myself. So as soon as this taunt runs out, the enemy's going to run away to whoever's done the most damage. Because everyone else is dealing damage, they're healing, they're generating threat all over the place. And this is the situation that you're talking about. Someone might run down the hill, challenge, everything follows them for 10 seconds, and then heaps of people have done damage, blah, 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 and they all run back up. This is kind of backwards. I don't want to use, in an AoE situation, I don't really want to use a taunt first, because I want to multiply the threat of my friends with my taunt. So if I use a skill like War Chant instead, I get a bunch of bonus threat, which lets me hold things for just a couple of seconds against the DPS. The DPS does a bunch of AoE damage, and then when I use Challenge, I'm going to multiply all of the threat that is on those enemies by a factor of almost 9 times. So it's a crazy value. So if you've done 1 million damage to that enemy, and then I taunt, I might as well have done 10 million damage. You have to do 10 million damage, almost. I think it's like 8.85 million damage before you're going to steal it back from me, which means I have that amount of time to do another taunt and again multiply your threat. So if you're waiting to do damage and you're holding off, it actually means that tanks have no ability to generate threat, because their ability to do damage to generate threat is so little on their own that it means that whenever you decide to eventually start doing damage, they're going to still be just behind you. So you want to use your damage skills, and this is like key in fights like Houses of Rest. If you remember the first boss, there are 4 dwarves, and the strategy is often to have the hunter sit right at the back, AoE, like do Rain of Arrows and Split Shot. If you have multiple hunters, you get them all to do it, and then the Guardian will hit Challenge, or the Captain will hit Elendil's Roar, or whatever it is, your AoE taunt, to get the aggro of all 4 of them by multiplying that threat. So it's a really common misconception, which you come across a lot, and it's really important, because this is like the entire way that tanking works, and I'll explain it much more detail with like numbers and examples and stuff in the tanking seminar. But yeah, for DPS players, especially if you're leading a group, don't tell your DPS to hold off. The only time I would say to hold off is when enemies are really spread apart and they're not priority targets. So often you might say in Hrimmel, there's like black arrows and frost callers and warriors all over the place. The hunters can single target down a black arrow, and a single taunt from a tank is going to take care of that. But all these other enemies, you don't want to be AoEing too much. You want to let the tank gather them together, then do some AoE or bank off the fact that healers have done healing aggro, and then they can challenge and get aggro. But as a tank, you don't
Okay.
want to pull things over to you with a taunt as much as you can. You want to wait until damage has been done to taunt so you can copy and multiply. But thank you for that question, because that is a huge point that is very commonly misconceived, and it's because it's changed over the years and was not really mentioned as a clear thing in game.
Well, and Doom has so many enemies. If they
Yeah.
AoE the tank, so yeah, you covered it then. That as far as gathering them.
Yeah, so
sometimes you have
let
to
them
wait.
gather them together with War Chant. But if they've popped their AoE taunt, then it's a bad situation because they're not going to have their AoE taunt back for another 30 seconds. And so you might as well just wait for 30 seconds then as the DPS, not 5. Like, it doesn't matter. If you've waited and they've popped their taunt, then you have to wait 30 more seconds, which is obviously a bad time.
Right.
Yeah. But thank you for that question.
Great.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Raid etiquette. Can you expand on what you mean by raid etiquette, Prudence? Do you mean like communications and showing up on time and being an all-round nice human being? Follow the raid leader. Yes. If the raid leader has come up with a strategy, then listen to them. They have probably thought about it longer than you have. If you have suggestions, then send them a private message, and you can give them a suggestion. Especially if you're maybe more experienced, you can say, "Hey, I've done this fight a bunch. I appreciate the effort you're doing as a raid leader. This is a really hard thing to do. I've done it a different way that you might find easier. Let me know if you'd like me to explain it." Instead of just trying to barge in the raid chat, spamming your text. You should do this differently. Why are you doing that, tank? That's silly. Like, don't. That's never helpful. Yeah, so that's one thing. Definitely listen to the raid leader. The other thing is like Discord and other tools like it, but Discord is obviously one of the most widely used. That's a huge tool for people to be able to communicate clearly. If you watch any video that has comms, you'll hear very clear calls. I can see Dar sitting in the channel. Dar is one of our shot callers in our group. So you don't want to be talking over people. You want to be listening to clear calls and listening for like burn hot call outs and what's happening. And the raid leader should be talking, but talk as much as your group needs, and then let them just play and concentrate and have clear comms. The other one I would suggest is tanks. It's really helpful if tanks can talk, because as I said before, tanks decide where the fight goes, not just how it happens. So if the tank is saying, I need to move over here, it's really good to give people a verbal heads up instead of just running off and frontaling everyone on the way over. Prudence says, would you briefly explain Tatia and Nelia? Yes. Our Tatia and Nelia rosters are our rosters in the Redemption Discord server, which basically determines what sort of runs are going to be run for those people. So our Tatia group is our mid-tier group, so runs that are like SV tier 2 and tier 3 boss 1 of the raid, those sorts of things. And then Nelia is our higher tier group, and they will be doing some harder instances. As has been recently announced, we're going to be revamping that system in the next couple of days. So look forward to that. I'm not spoiling anything here because this is on camera. Northrim is the redemption tag. If you are a redemption member, you have that tag in game. If you're in the redemption kinship, there is a kin only chat that you can join and see LFF for that only in there. If you would like to join our kinship, message any one of the inner council members and we will get you in. Dar says, try to carry class-specific buffs, wound, and other clear pots and so on. That is a great point. That is a very good point, Dar. There are many consumables that classes have. I know, for example, hunters have devastation pots, and I'm sure others exist. Guardians use shield spikes, etc. But have a look at what your class can use. Find out how to use it when is good. Yes, Bjorning Wrath Pots, they're good. Have them in plenty before raid. Try to bring scrolls and hope tokens so you can be helpful. You can be an ethical raid member and do hope and scroll for your group. Bring food so you can have your poison resist for 20 minutes of a 25-minute fight. Very helpful. You can also make sure you have wound and fear pots. My wound pots are not on my bar because there's nothing that I can't clear with Ignore the Pain. But fear pots are very good, especially in the current instance. You need to use your fear pots. Spoiler for tomorrow's seminar, use a keybind for your fear pots so you can click it quickly. Yes, I will mention Yellow Hunters and other such specs. They do exist. I acknowledge their existence. So do Blue Hunters. I only mentioned three classes as being good support. That pretty much covers it for who I'm going to take in a raid. The problem is that they just don't provide the level of support that is valued at a whole spot. Burglars and Lawmasters and Captains provide more than their slot in support. But yeah, mostly yellow is used for the Moors, as I understand it. I'm not really a PvMP player, and hopefully it will be dealt with in sufficient fashion in the near future. Babel, are you talking about races as in redemption races? They're great. I'm also going to bounce off that point and say the race of your character matters a little bit. Yeah, hobbits are bad, unfortunately. You might notice that you have racial traits. These are things like +% damage on weapon types and a stat and other things and a cooldown. Everyone has a group cooldown and everyone has a self cooldown. Some of them are very bad and some of them are very good. Men have very good, and women, race of man, have very good group-wide fellowship buff, raid-wide fellowship, no, group-wide fellowship buff. Duty-bound, that's very powerful. Dwarves have a less potent vitality buff that they provide the group. They have a very good self buff, -50% incoming damage for 10 seconds. Men have a gross self heal that does like 5,000 morale in the days of having 1 million health. Elves do more bow damage. High elves do more light damage and swords and the like. So if you are a race, which everyone is, make sure you're using your correct weapon. So you get extra damage. It really does make a difference. All right, it looks like we're out of questions. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone who showed up, and I hope people on the VOD find this helpful. I will provide chapters so that you can find the little section of the video that you wish to watch. And yeah, if you ever need to refer back to this, it will be posted for people to watch again, including all the questions, which is going to be great. So have a good one. I hope my recording worked. And I will see you all tomorrow for the UI and plugin seminar, which, hint, hint, wink, wink, is more important than this one. It's going to make a bigger difference to your raid performance. I promise.